Imagine you can feel the cold, not the cold of an air-conditioned room or a winter morning wrapped in a coat. The real cold, the kind that soaks through leather, through wool, through skin, and settles inside your bones like it belongs there. You are standing on the deck of a ship that smells of salt and pine tar and iron. Around you, men with scarred hands and quiet eyes row in silence. No one speaks. No one needs to. You are a Viking, and you are alive, which in this world is the only currency that matters. A Norse village, firelight in longhouse windows, a horn being blown at dawn. For nearly 300 years, from the late 8th century to the end of the 11th, the Norse people carved their mark into the bones of the known world. They sailed to Iceland, Greenland, and the coast of North America a full 5 centuries before Columbus was born. They traded amber and furs from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea. They founded the city of Kiev. They served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. They raided every coastline from Ireland to the Mediterranean, and the prayers of European monks, a furore Normanorum libera nos, Domine, from the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord, became the terrified refrain of an entire civilization. But here is the thing about a civilization built on steel and fate. It does not let its people die quietly. The Norse had a word, strain. It referred to a death in bed, a soft death, a slow death, the kind of death that came without glory, without witnesses, without meaning. To die that way was to risk being denied entry into Valhalla, the great mead hall of the slain, where the chosen warriors feasted alongside Odin until the end of the world itself. And so the Norse, in their extraordinary and terrible logic, made pain into proof, made suffering into ritual, made death into a final, defining performance. This is the story of 10 people who performed that final act, not with peace, not with grace, but with an anguish so profound, so deliberately inflicted, so entwined with the culture that produced it, that history has never been able to look away. To understand these deaths, you must first understand this world. Norse society was not the crude, unlettered chaos that medieval Christian chroniclers described. It was extraordinarily sophisticated. The Thing was one of the earliest democratic assemblies in human history, a gathering where free men voted, resolved disputes, and made law. Norse women held property rights that English women would not achieve for another 800 years. Their poetry, the skaldic verse in the Eddic sagas, was technically complex, emotionally layered, and philosophically rich. They were traders before they were raiders, merchants before they were warriors, and they understood, with a clarity that still feels modern, that the world was cyclical, impermanent, and ultimately indifferent to human survival. Their cosmology reflected this. The world tree, Yggdrasil, held 9 worlds in its branches and roots. At its base, 3 Norns, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, wove the threads of fate for every living thing. No one escaped their weaving, not the gods, not Odin himself. Not even Thor would survive Ragnarok, the apocalyptic twilight of the gods, where serpent and wolf and fire would unmake everything that ever was. When you live inside a mythology that insists even gods die violently and inevitably, the manner of your own death becomes enormously, desperately important. And sometimes, as we are about to witness, the manner of death was chosen not by fate, but by an enemy with time on his hands and a point to make. 1. Ragnar Lothbrok, the Pit of Serpents, circa 865 AD. Of all the deaths in Viking history, few are as cinematically brutal, or as symbolically perfect, as the death attributed to the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the Old Norse saga Ragnar's Saga Lothbrokr, the great warlord was captured by King Ælla of Northumbria after a failed raid on England. Ælla, wanting a death that matched the scale of Ragnar's reputation, chose a punishment of theatrical cruelty. He had Ragnar thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. The horror of this death is not just physical, though the slow paralysis, the repeated strikes across exposed skin, the inability to fight back against an enemy too small and too numerous to resist is nightmarish to contemplate. The deeper horror is the time involved. Ragnar did not die instantly. He felt each bite. He watched the swelling begin. He lay in the pit and, according to the sagas, laughed and composed poetry. How the little pigs would grunt, he reportedly said, if they knew how the old boar suffers. A message to his sons, a warning to Ælla, a final act of defiance composed in agony. The sons, Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, and their brothers, would return to avenge him with an army so large it darkened the horizon. 2. King Ælla of Northumbria, the Blood Eagle, 867 AD, which brings us to the man who ordered the snake pit and the price he paid. When Ragnar's sons returned with the great heathen army and captured Ælla, they chose for him the most notorious execution in the Norse tradition, the Blodurn, the Blood Eagle. The sources are disputed, the historicity debated by scholars, but the sagas are unambiguous in their description. The victim was held face down. Their ribs were severed from the spine, each one with an axe or knife cracked away from the vertebrae. The rib cage was then spread outward like wings. The lungs were pulled through the opening and draped over the shoulders, still breathing, still moving, like a grotesque set of wings pulsing in the cold air. Whether this was performed on a living Ælla, or whether it was performed post-mortem as a ritual offering to Odin, remains an open question. But the intention, the message encoded in the act, is unmistakably clear. This was not just execution. This was transformation. The enemy was unmade, displayed, dedicated. In Norse cosmology, to give a great enemy to Odin was an honor. Twisted, terrifying, but sincere. Ælla was not simply killed, he was offered. 3. Edmund of East Anglia, tied to a tree, 869 AD. In the autumn of 869 AD, the great heathen army turned south to East Anglia. King Edmund, a young Christian ruler, refused to renounce his faith or share his kingdom with Ivar the Boneless. He was captured, tied to a tree, and used as target practice. The Danes shooting arrows into him one by one, deliberately keeping him alive through each wound. When the arrowheads were finally too many to count, they beheaded him. The head was thrown into the forest. The body was left to bleed. Edmund was later sainted. But before the sanctification and the miracles and the pilgrims, there was simply a young man tied to a tree in November, watching the arrows come, refusing to recant, enduring something no theology fully prepares a person for. 4. Sigurd the Stout. Death by his own severed head, 1014 AD. Not all painful Viking deaths came from enemies. Some arrived by an almost cosmic irony. Sigurd Tryggvason, Earl of Orkney, was a formidable Norse lord. After defeating his enemy, Maelbricta, he beheaded the man and tied the trophy to his saddle, as warriors did, and rode home in triumph. During the ride, the dead man's teeth raked against Sigurd's leg. The wound became infected. Septicemia set in, a slow, agonizing systemic poisoning that would have involved fever, swelling, blackened tissue, and delirium stretching across days. He died from the bite of a man already dead. The Norse would have recognized this immediately as fate's signature, the unmistakable handwriting of the Norns. You cannot outride what is woven for you. 5. Jarl Hákon, killed by his own slave, 995 AD. Hákon Sigurdsson, the powerful pagan jarl who ruled Norway, died in the most humiliating manner imaginable for a Viking lord, in a pigsty, at the hands of his own thrall. Fleeing from the rebellion led by Olaf Tryggvason, Hákon hid beneath a farm in Mæren, sheltering in an underground pig pen with his slave Karkur. In the darkness, Karkur slit his master's throat. He then delivered the head to Olaf, expecting reward. Instead, Olaf ordered the thrall executed on the spot. Hákon, who had once been the most feared man in the North Sea, was degraded in death 3 times over, hiding like prey, slaughtered without combat, and desecrated by a man who legally owned nothing, not even his own name. The sagas record that the people of Trondheim stoned and mutilated Hákon's body with a contempt usually reserved for the irredeemably dishonored. 6. Olaf Tryggvason, surrounded and drowning, 1000 AD. The same Olaf who received Hákon's head met his own end 5 years later at the Battle of Svolder. A naval ambush so perfectly orchestrated it reads like a tragedy written in advance. Betrayed by former allies, Olaf found his longship, the Long Serpent, the greatest warship of the age, surrounded on all sides. His warriors fell one by one until the deck was red and almost empty. Olaf, wounded, leapt from the stern rail into the sea. He was never seen again. The Norwegians refused to believe he was dead for generations. Legends circulated that he had survived, was living in exile, would return. But the sea took him, the freezing, indifferent Norse sea. And what the sea takes, it does not give back. The most painful part of Olaf's death may have been the waiting, the watching of everything he built dissolve around him before the water closed overhead. 7. Thorkel the Tall's brother. Torn apart at Rendlesham, 1012 AD. In 1012, Danish forces captured Archbishop Alphege of Canterbury and held him for ransom. When the ransom wasn't paid, the drunken Danish troops pelted him with bones and ox heads until he collapsed, then finished him with an axe blow. Among the Norse in that camp was Thorkel the Tall, who reportedly tried to buy the archbishop's life with everything he owned. He failed. The incident is significant not for the victim alone, but for what it did to Thorkel, a Viking so sickened by the murder of an unarmed holy man that he defected to the English side, taking 45 ships with him. Some deaths are painful not for the one who dies, but for the one left watching. 8. Blot sacrifice victims. The Uppsala Temple, ongoing pre-1100 AD. The Great Temple at Uppsala was the most sacred site in the Norse world. Every 9 years a festival was held. Blot. 9 of every male creature were gathered, cattle, horses, dogs, and men. They were killed and hung in the sacred grove surrounding the temple, their bodies left to sway in the trees for 9 days as an offering to Odin, Thor, and Freyr. Adam of Bremen, who documented this in the 11th century, described the grove with visible horror, a place of dangling corpses and dried blood, where the smell alone announced the sacred. The human sacrifices, often slaves or prisoners of war, were not killed quickly. They were strangled or hanged, their death a slow, airless, suspended agony designed to mirror Odin's own sacrifice on Yggdrasil, where the All-Father hung for 9 days pierced by his own spear, dying to gain the wisdom of the runes. Even divine knowledge in this worldview must be purchased with unbearable suffering. 9. Ivar the Boneless. A life of physical agony, died circa 873 AD. Ivar's death itself was reportedly peaceful, unusual for a man who caused so much suffering in others, but his life may have been the punishment. The exact meaning of his nickname is debated by historians. Some believe he suffered from osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, or a severe form of hypermobility that left him unable to walk. The sagas describe him as carried into battle on a shield, directing tactics with a terrifying intelligence, while physically incapable of wielding the weapons himself. To be Ivar the Boneless in the world of the Norse, where physical strength was sacred, where walking unaided to your death was a virtue, was to live inside a kind of perpetual humiliation that no amount of battlefield genius could fully erase. He was perhaps the greatest Viking strategist who ever lived, and perhaps also the most imprisoned by his own flesh. He planned the Blood Eagle for Ælla, he architected the great heathen army, he conquered half of Britain, and he may have done all of it from a stretcher, in constant pain, proving something to a world that would always see weakness before it saw brilliance. 10. The Lindisfarne monks. The first dawn of the Viking Age, 793 AD. In June of 793 AD, on a small holy island off the coast of Northumbria, the Viking Age announced itself. The monastery of Lindisfarne, one of the most celebrated centers of Christian learning in the world, home to the Lindisfarne Gospels, to centuries of sacred art and scholarship, was attacked at dawn. The monks who had no walls, no weapons, and no warning were killed at their prayers. Alcuin of York wrote afterward in anguish, Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. The survivors described men in iron and fur, who moved like something out of a nightmare, efficient, pitiless, and gone before anyone could respond. The monks who were not killed were enslaved, dragged to ships in the fog, taken north across water they had never seen, into a world that had no place for them. Of all the deaths in this story, theirs are perhaps the most quietly devastating. Not because they were the most elaborate or the most mythologized, but because they were the most innocent. Men who had given their lives to learning, to preservation, to something gentle and enduring, ended in the first chapter of a story they never knew had started. Here is the hard truth that all of this reveals. The Norse did not love suffering for its own sake. They were not sadists performing cruelty without philosophy. They were people who had looked at the world, at its randomness, its indifference, its absolute refusal to guarantee safety or meaning, and decided that the only power left to a human being was the manner in which they met what came for them. They built an entire culture around that single idea. The blood eagle was not mindless brutality. It was a theology. The serpent pit was not just revenge. It was theater, composed to outlast the men who performed it. The sacrifices at Uppsala were not primitive superstition. They were a civilization's sincere attempt to negotiate with forces it understood to be larger, older, and more dangerous than itself. And yet, and here is where the tragedy deepens, the very values that made Viking culture extraordinary were also what made it unsustainable. A world that glorifies violent death above peaceful life will, over generations, exhaust itself. The berserkers who were most valued in battle were the most uncontrollable in peacetime. The raiding economy that generated wealth and glory also prevented the development of stable governance. The theology of fate, the Norns weaving everything, Ragnarok coming regardless, made resistance to change feel cosmologically futile. By 1100 AD, the Viking Age was effectively over. Not because the Norse were defeated in any single catastrophic battle, but because Christianity offered something the old religion structurally could not. The idea that the world could be improved, that the poor and the meek had value, that mercy was a strength, not a weakness. It is one of history's most quietly devastating ironies. The people who feared nothing, who laughed in snake pits and composed poetry with arrows in their bodies, were ultimately transformed not by a superior army, but by a different story about what suffering means. There is a moment in every mythology where you can see the fear beneath the bravado. The Norse built Valhalla because they were afraid of dying without meaning. They built the blood eagle because they were afraid of enemies who felt no fear. They hung their offerings in sacred groves because they were afraid that the cosmos did not notice them at all. All of it, every terrible, magnificent, blood-soaked detail, was a civilization's answer to the oldest human question. Does any of this matter? And they answered it the only way they knew. Loudly, painfully, with iron and poetry and fire. The monks at Lindisfarne died in silence, at prayer. Ragnar Lothbrok died laughing in a pit of snakes. Ivar the Boneless commanded armies from a stretcher and never let anyone forget that the body's limits are not the mind's. Sigurd the Stout was killed by a dead man's teeth, reminded by fate itself that even victory is temporary. These deaths are not just history, they are a mirror. We still live in a world that decides, constantly, which kinds of suffering are meaningful and which are merely unfortunate. We still build our systems around unspoken agreements about whose pain matters and whose doesn't. We still tell ourselves stories about why the people at the top deserve to be there, and why the people at the bottom maybe brought it on themselves. The Vikings are gone. The longships have rotted. The great temple at Uppsala was torn down and a Christian church built over its foundations. But the question they were trying to answer, how do you face something that cannot be stopped? That question has never aged a single day. The stone remains, even after the water comes. If history has taught us anything, it's that the most powerful thing a person can do, in a snake pit, on a battlefield, in a pigsty, in a sacred grove, is choose the story they tell about it.